Personal log, Sol 14. Dr. Edgar Voss, Mission Specialist, Project CHARONOS. Date classified. I never wanted to come to Mars. Not because of fear. Fear is a luxury men like me have long abandoned. But because some places should stay undiscovered. Some questions should stay unanswered. We found something buried deep beneath Olympus Mons. Something that shouldn't exist. It started with a whisper. The first transmission came 3 weeks ago. A pulse, a deep space anomaly picked up by NASA's orbital arrays. They said it was just noise, interference caused by solar winds. But the data told a different story. Something buried beneath the Martian regolith was responding, calling. It wasn't a natural formation. It wasn't a cave system or an old lava tube. It was a structure, a sphere, impossibly smooth, spanning nearly 5 kilometers beneath the surface. Its surface emitted no heat, no radiation, no magnetic field. But when we probed deeper, we heard it, a deep, rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. That was enough for them to send us. Project CHARONOS wasn't a public mission. This wasn't a grand expedition for the history books. We were the ones who went where others shouldn't. The 6 of us had trained for years, knowing full well we wouldn't be remembered, that the real story would never make it beyond the black ink of classified files. I told myself that was fine. I told myself that until I saw the thing with my own eyes. We descended into the excavation site at 0600 hours, wearing reinforced EVA suits lined with lead polymer plating. Overkill, but no one was taking chances. The drilling teams had carved a path deep into the Martian crust, and at the end of it, hidden beneath a veil of ochre dust, was the anomaly. Smooth, black, not rock, not metal, something else entirely. It wasn't supposed to be there. Jesus, muttered Dr. Holloway, our resident linguist. He stood beside me, visor tilted up, staring at the surface of a thing like a man staring into the void. It's untouched, no erosion, Captain Reynolds said, running a gloved hand along the structure. No micrometeorite impacts. This thing's been under rock for millions of years, and it's still pristine. I kept quiet. I'd seen the drone scans. The anomaly wasn't just buried under rock. It had been placed there, deliberately. Dr. Owen, our geologist, was already scanning the markings, etched symbols covering the surface in intricate patterns. They were unlike any language we'd ever encountered. What do you make of them? Reynolds asked. Holloway exhaled, his breath fogging his visor. They're familiar. I turned sharply. Familiar how? He hesitated, then placed a hand against the surface. His helmet's external light flickered across the carvings, casting long shadows. I don't know. I feel like I've seen them before. That was the first red flag. The second was when the ground trembled beneath us. At first, I thought it was a minor tremor. Mars had seismic activity, after all. But then the hum began. Deep, vibrational. It wasn't coming from the planet. It was coming from inside the anomaly. We all froze. What the hell? Owen started, but his voice cut off in a sharp gasp. The symbols glowed. A faint, eerie blue, like bioluminescence beneath deep water. The glow pulsed, slow and rhythmic, in perfect synchronization with a heartbeat like signal we'd detected weeks prior. Then our comms cut out. Reynolds cursed, tapping his helmet. Mission Control, this is Captain Reynolds. Do you read? Static. I checked my own systems. No signal. No uplink to the orbital station. This is bad, muttered Holloway. A metallic groan filled the cavern, vibrating through the rock, through us. The anomaly was shifting. A seam, previously invisible, began to widen along its surface. A door, no, a wound, was opening. And behind it, darkness. Not the absence of light. Something deeper. For the first time in my life, I felt watched. Reynolds took point, signaling for us to form up. Stay close. Helmets sealed. We don't move unless I say so. I should have stopped him. I should have run. But instead, I followed. We stepped through the wound in the anomaly into the black. And the black stepped into us. The air inside was thick. That was the first impossibility. Mars had no breathable atmosphere, no pressure to carry sound the way Earth did. And yet, the moment we crossed the threshold into the anomaly, Our helmets picked up something, a faint resonance, like the deep hum of a submerged cathedral. The kind of sound that pressed against your chest and curled around your thoughts. Reynolds was the first to break the silence. Owen, atmospheric readings. Owen hesitated before replying, his voice tight. Oxygen, nitrogen, trace amounts of argon. Pressures holding steady at 14.7 psi. Earth standard, I muttered. No one responded. I switched off my external air supply. The hiss of my helmet depressurizing sounded obscene in the silence. I inhaled. The air was stale, old beyond comprehension, tinged with something metallic. Blood and rust. The floor beneath us wasn't metal. Not exactly. It shifted underfoot, solid yet disturbingly pliant, like petrified bone wrapped in something not entirely dead. The walls stretched high above us, smooth and unblemished, curving in unnatural, organic arches. They pulsed with a bioluminescent sheen, casting a cold blue glow that gave the impression of depthless water. This place is huge, Holloway whispered. He was right. The cavernous space stretched into infinity, defying all logic. From the outside, the anomaly had a measurable diameter. Inside, it felt endless. Stay close, Reynolds ordered. No wandering. We mark our path and stick to it. Our boots left no prints. Something shifted in the distance, a sound like wet fabric dragging across stone. Owen turned sharply. Did you hear that? I had, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. Reynolds activated his wrist beacon, the white beam cutting through the unnatural gloom. Move forward, slow and steady. The moment the light swept across the far wall, Holloway let out a choked sound. Carvings, thousands of them, lining the walls in erratic, swirling patterns. The same ancient script as before, but now unmistakably moving, shifting like ripples on black water. I stepped closer. They weren't etched into the surface. They were growing from it, like tumors of language trying desperately to speak. Holloway lifted a shaking hand and traced one of the symbols. The moment his glove made contact, the pulsing light flickered, just for a second, but in that second, the silence changed. The resonance deepened, becoming something else. Breathing. Something behind the walls was breathing. Owen swore under his breath. We need to go. Now. Reynolds nodded, backing away. Mark the exit. I turned, scanning the path behind us. The entrance should have been there. It should have been there. It wasn't. The passage we'd entered through had vanished, swallowed by the same shifting walls that now pulsed with something too close to life. I swallowed hard, pulse hammering. It was right there. Reynolds pivoted sharply. Nobody panics. We retrace our steps, find another way out. The breathing sound deepened. Not one source. Many. The walls began to change. Darkness bled through the glowing veins, coalescing into shapes. Silhouettes. Human but wrong. One stood taller than the rest, its form shifting like a smear of oil on water. It had no face, no distinct features, just an absence of light, stretched into the vague impression of something that used to be one of us. And then, it moved, not with motion, not like something stepping forward. One moment, it was against the far wall. The next, it was inches from Reynolds. No sound, no warning, just there. Reynolds staggered back, rifle raised. Stay back. The thing did not obey. It tilted its head, no, its entire form, as though studying him. And then it spoke. You should not be here. Reynolds fired. The muzzle flash cut through the gloom, but the bullets passed through the entity like smoke through a net. No impact, no resistance. The creature laughed, a warping, distorted echo of our own voices. I heard my own cadence in its tone, fractured and wrong. Then it whispered, "You were always here." Owen screamed. I turned just in time to see him being pulled backward, hands clawing at the ground as something unseen dragged him into the dark. His helmet light flickered wildly, illuminating glimpses of... No, not glimpses. Reflections. Not of us. Of something mimicking us. Stretched faces and gaping mouths, frozen in perfect mockery of horror. Then Owen was gone. The silence swallowed him whole. Holloway gasped, backing away, shaking his head. No, 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 no. We move, Reynolds ordered. His voice was shaking now. We don't stop. We don't separate. Stay close, and we move. We ran. The architecture twisted around us, bending space, breaking the laws of physics as the corridors elongated, shifted, watched us. I felt it. Not a presence, not a creature, an intelligence, something vast and ancient, observing from beyond the thin membrane of reality. Reynolds was leading, his breathing ragged through the calms. There, exit. I saw it. A distant opening in the churning architecture. A doorway leading into something bright. But just before we reached it, the thing spoke again. Not in words, not in sound, directly into our minds. You cannot leave. Reynolds collapsed mid-stride, hands clawing at his helmet, screaming. Blood ran from his nose, his eyes. His body convulsed, fingers twitching spasmodically. Then he went still. Holloway grabbed my arm. He's gone, Voss. We need to go. I hesitated. Reynolds' body twitched. And then he stood, slowly, his head tilted toward me, his face now expressionless. Dr. Voss, he said, you need to come back. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't him. Not anymore. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the light, until the doorway swallowed me whole. And then, silence. I turned back. The anomaly was gone. The corridor, the shifting walls, the entity, nothing remained. Just red Martian rock. And Holloway, panting beside me, staring at the space where none of it had ever been. We had escaped, but we were not alone. Not anymore. The silence was worse than the screams. For a long moment, neither Holloway nor I spoke. We just stood there, staring at the space where the corridor, where Reynolds had been. The walls of the anomaly, the impossible, shifting structures, the entity that had whispered in our heads, gone. In its place, cold Martian rock, as if it had never been there at all. Holloway was the first to break. He doubled over, hands on his knees, his breath rasping through the calms. That didn't happen, he muttered. That didn't happen. I looked down at my boots. They were still coated in the thin, black sheen of whatever material made up the anomaly's interior. I could feel it, smell it, an acrid metallic stench that lingered in my helmet. It happened, I said. My voice sounded wrong. Hollow. Holloway straightened, rubbing a gloved hand over his visor as if trying to wipe away something unseen. Reynolds is dead. His voice cracked. Owen is gone. I nodded. We should be too, he added. Voss, we need to get back to the rover. Get a base camp. Call for evac. He stopped mid-sentence. I turned. The dust around us was moving. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the thin Martian atmosphere, but then I saw it, tiny whirls of red sand spiraling in slow, deliberate patterns, forming symbols against the ground. The same symbols we'd seen inside. I took a step back. Holloway. He was already moving. We need to run. We didn't argue. We turned, sprinting across the excavation site, boots kicking up clouds of ochre dust. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was behind us, something watching, something waiting. The rover was in sight. 50 meters. 30. 20. The ground beneath us shifted. Not a tremor. Not a quake. Something deliberate. I stumbled, barely catching myself before my helmet hit the ground. My vision swam. For a moment, I wasn't on Mars. I was standing in my childhood home. My mother's voice floated from the kitchen. The smell of coffee, warm and inviting, filled the air. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting familiar golden hues against the floorboards. Then I blinked. I was back on Mars, gasping, heart hammering against my ribs. Holloway had collapsed beside me, clutching his head. No, no, no. He was somewhere else too. I grabbed his arm, shaking him. Snap out of it, Holloway. It's not real. His breath hitched. His hands trembled. The illusion cracked. The pressure in my skull lessened. The dust settled. I dragged Holloway to his feet, practically throwing him toward the rover. We climbed in, sealed the doors, and depressurized the cabin. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I activated the comms. Mission Control, this is Dr. Edgar Voss. Do you read? Static. No response. Holloway slumped against his seat, his hands still shaking. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at his reflection in the cabin glass. "Something is wrong with me," he whispered. I followed his gaze. His reflection wasn't matching his movements. I felt my stomach drop. "Holloway." His breath hitched. The reflection turned to look at me. It smiled. Holloway screamed. I grabbed him, pulling him away from the glass. "Close your eyes." I closed them. His breathing was ragged, his pulse erratic. But he obeyed. The reflection didn't disappear. It kept watching, kept smiling. Then it did something else. It raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and tapped on the glass. A muffled sound, too deep, too heavy, like a fist against a coffin lid. I tore my gaze away, activating the rover's engines. The wheels kicked up dust as we lurched forward, racing across the Martian surface. Base camp was 2 kilometers away. Holloway was silent now, gripping the sides of his seat so hard his knuckles turned white. He hadn't opened his eyes. "Talk to me," I urged. "What did you see?" His lips parted. "Then, you were already here." The voice wasn't his. I felt ice crawl down my spine. I risked a glance. Holloway was staring straight ahead. His face was pale, his pupils blown wide. I gripped the controls tighter. Something was inside him. I pressed the accelerator, heart hammering. "We're almost there," I muttered. Holloway let out a breathless, fractured laugh. "No, we're not." The base came into view. My pulse surged with relief until I saw the lights. They were on. Too bright. Too many. A moment ago, our camp had housed 6 structures, temporary habitats built for a skeleton crew. Now there were dozens. The layout had changed. Shifted. No, not shifted, doubled. There were 2 base camps. Identical. Mirrored perfectly against the desolate landscape. Holloway inhaled sharply. "Voss, which one is ours?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. I pulled the rover to a stop, staring at the impossible sight before us. 2 bases. 2 landing pads. 2 communications towers blinking in perfect unison. Something moved near the entrance of the left camp. A figure. A person. No, people. A group of 6, wearing EVA suits. Their visors were up. Even from here, I could see their faces. I recognized them immediately. It was us, standing at the entrance of both camps. Watching. Waiting. Holloway exhaled, his voice barely audible. "We never left." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. No, that wasn't true. We had escaped. We had left. Hadn't we? A distorted voice crackled through the comms, garbled and broken. It was mine. "Dr. Voss, you need to come back." I reached for the radio, but my hand hesitated. Somewhere deep in my gut, I already knew the truth. We had never escaped. We had never left at all. There was no right answer. 2 identical base camps. 2 groups of us. 2 versions of reality laid out before us, like a cruel joke, daring us to choose. Holloway was gripping the dashboard, breath shallow, body trembling. I didn't blame him. The rational mind wasn't built to process this, wasn't built to stand at the precipice of something that should be impossible. And yet, here we were. My fingers twitched over the controls. "We have to pick one." Holloway turned to me, his pupils still blown wide. "Pick what? Do you hear yourself? We don't even know if we're real." I swallowed hard. He wasn't wrong. The figures at both camps remained motionless. 6 people. Our crew. Some alive, some dead. Each group standing in eerie silence, staring. The comms crackled again. My own voice, warped and distant. "Dr. Voss, you need to come back." Holloway whimpered. "They sound like you." My mouth was dry. I knew what was coming next. A second voice cut through the static. It was Holloway's. "Edgar, you have to choose." I gritted my teeth. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I forced myself to focus. The left camp or the right? One of them was a trap. One of them was... No, they were both traps. I took my hands off the controls. "We're not going to either," I said. Holloway blinked at me. "What?" I reached for the emergency thrusters. We bypassed the camps entirely. We go straight to the lander. Holloway hesitated, then nodded rapidly, as if afraid that stopping to think would break him entirely. I punched the thrusters. The rover lurched forward, kicking up dust, leaving both impossible base camps behind. The figures did not move. They just watched. I gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles aching. How far to the lander? Holloway checked his wrist display. 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers across Martian wasteland. It might as well have been light years. I didn't look back. I refused to look back. The hum started again. That deep, resonant vibration. It was inside my skull, pressing against my thoughts, warping the world around me. My vision blurred. The landscape flickered. For a split second, I saw something else. Something vast and cold, stretching beyond the thin veil of reality. Watching me, I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus on the horizon. A shadow passed over us. I didn't see it. Not fully, but I felt it. Something enormous, moving just beyond perception, dragging itself through the space between dimensions. Holloway screamed. I turned. He was convulsing in his seat, body rigid, eyes rolling back in his skull. His mouth moved, but the words that came out weren't his. They weren't words at all. A rush of sound, garbled and layered, like 1,000 voices speaking in reverse. I grabbed his arm. Holloway, stay with me. His eyes snapped forward. For a moment, he was lucid, his breathing ragged, his fingers twitching. Then he whispered. We never left. The rover jerked violently. I slammed the brakes. The lander was in front of us. I exhaled a sharp, shaking breath. We made it. Holloway didn't move. His gaze was fixed on something behind me. Slowly, heart pounding, I turned. I saw myself, standing next to the rover. Still, silent, watching. My stomach twisted. The other me didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, its presence a gaping wound in reality. Then it smiled. Not a normal smile. Something stretched too far, too wide. It lifted one hand. A single, slow wave. Holloway was sobbing now, rocking back and forth in his seat. I moved. I ripped open the rover door, dragging Holloway with me. We stumbled onto the red dust, half running, half falling toward the lander. The access hatch was open, the emergency beacon blinking its rhythmic pulse. The thing in my shape remained by the rover, watching. But I knew, somehow, it wasn't alone. They were all watching. Shadows moving in the dust, figures standing just at the edges of perception. Waiting. We reached the ladder. I shoved Holloway up first, following close behind. The inside of the lander was dark, the only light coming from the control panel's dim glow. I sealed the hatch. The noise outside stopped. Dead silence. My breath rasped against the helmet glass. My hands trembled. Holloway slumped against the bulkhead, eyes unfocused. We have to leave. We have to go now. I nodded, moving to the controls. The systems flickered to life. One launch command, one ignition sequence. I reached for the switch. A voice whispered in my ear. Not over radio, not over comms, directly into my mind. You were always here. A hand grabbed my wrist. Holloway's hand. But his face. It wasn't his face anymore. It was shifting, changing, flickering between him and something else. My breath caught. A realization crashed through me like ice water. I was the only one who made it to the lander. I yanked my arm away, shoving myself back. Holloway, the thing wearing his skin, tilted its head. Then slowly it grinned. You're too late. The lander shook. A deep, thunderous pulse resonated through the walls, through my bones, through my mind. I turned. The viewport revealed Mars outside, endless and red. But it wasn't Mars anymore. Not really. The sky was wrong. The horizon twisted, shifting between here and somewhere else. I saw shadows moving beneath the sand. Not people. Things. The ground opened. Not like an earthquake. Not like a collapse. It opened like a mouth. I reached for the launch controls. Holloway lunged. I didn't think. I reacted. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling back. I hit the switch. The engines roared to life. A deafening explosion of force, pressure slamming me into my seat as the lander tore away from the surface. Through the viewport, I saw the anomaly below, saw it for what it really was. A prison, a wound in the universe. And it was opening. The figures in the dust, dozens, hundreds, lifted their heads. All of them wearing our faces. all of them smiling. Then Mars was gone. The lander breached orbit, silence pressing down on me like a lead weight. I turned. Holloway was gone. The cockpit was empty. I was alone. The comms flickered. Static. Then, Dr. Voss, do you read? A voice I recognized. Mission control. I swallowed, heart hammering. I reached for the radio. Then I hesitated. My own voice echoed back at me. Edgar, you have to choose. The static deepened. The stars outside the viewport shifted. I clenched my jaw, staring at the endless void ahead. Had I really escaped? Or had I never left?